The wind was sharp like broken glass, cutting across the frozen land. Snow fell heavy from the dark sky, covering everything in white silence. A human man walked slowly, each step sinking deep into the snow. His breath came out in clouds, and his face was red from the cold. He carried a small bag on his back with food and tools, returning from a supply run that had taken him far from his small cabin. The world felt empty, dead, and endless. Only the sound of crunching snow under his boots breaking the silence. He pulled his coat tighter and lowered his head against the wind. The storm was getting worse, and he knew he had to move faster before night arrived. In this frozen land, night meant death if you were outside without shelter. He looked up, his eyes scanning the white horizon, and that was when he saw something unusual. At first, he thought his tired mind was playing tricks on him, that the shapes in the snow were just rocks. But as he moved closer, he stopped. His eyes widened. There were two bodies lying in the snow. He rushed forward, his boots sinking deeper as his heart began to race. When he reached them, he saw two young alien women, both lying close to each other as if trying to share warmth. Their bodies shook weakly, their skin pale under the ice. They were shivering so hard their teeth clattered, but their eyes were half shut, almost frozen. Snow had already started to bury them. And if he had come even a little later, they might not have been alive at all. The man knelt beside them, his gloved hand brushing snow from their faces. Their skin was not human. It was smoother, faintly glowing under the dim light, with strange blue markings across their cheeks. Their hair was long, tangled with ice, and their clothes were torn as if they had run from something or someone. He felt their cold skin, almost like touching stone, and he knew they were dying. One of them let out a weak sound, a whisper he could not understand. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, showing a strange bright color unlike anything he had seen before. She looked at him in fear, then her eyes closed again. The other sister tried to move, but her body gave out, collapsing into the snow. The man's breath caught. He knew the stories. Aliens. Not from this land, not from his people. Some said they were dangerous, some said they were cursed, and others said saving one could bring death. He looked around the empty white land, his heart torn. He could walk away and pretend he never saw them. That would be the safer choice. But as he stared at their shaking, dying bodies, something inside him refused. He could not leave them. He could not let them freeze here in the snow like forgotten shadows. Quickly, he dropped his bag and pulled out his thick blanket. He wrapped it around the sisters, lifting them one by one. Their bodies were so light, almost weightless, but cold like ice blocks. The man gritted his teeth, feeling the storm pushing against him. His cabin was still far away, and carrying them would slow him down. But there was no other choice. He bent his knees, gathered them both in his arms, and stood tall against the wind. Their faint breaths brushed against his chest as he carried them. And he could feel how fragile they were, like glass ready to break. Each step through the heavy snow felt harder, but he kept moving, telling himself over and over, just a little further, just keep going. The wind howled louder, as if trying to steal them from him. The snow whipped against his face, blinding him, but he tightened his grip. The older sister stirred weakly, opening her eyes again. She looked at him with confusion, her lips moving. She tried to speak in her alien tongue, her words broken and soft, but he could not understand. Her voice carried fear, as if she did not know whether he meant to help them or harm them. He met her gaze for only a moment, and he did not speak. He only held her closer and kept walking. Her eyes slowly closed again, and he feared she might not open them once more. The storm grew wild. His legs burned from the effort, but his mind pushed forward. He remembered the warmth of his cabin, the fire waiting to be lit, and blankets thick enough to fight the cold. He imagined placing them by the fire, saving them from death, giving them another chance to breathe. That thought gave him strength. He refused to let the snow claim them. At last, after what felt like endless hours, he saw a faint shadow in the white distance, his cabin. His heart leapt. He hurried, stumbling once or twice, but never letting go of the sisters. When he reached the wooden door, he kicked it open with his boot, stepping inside and slamming it shut against the storm. The cabin was cold and dark, but at least it was shelter. He laid the sisters gently on the floor, shaking snow from their bodies. Their lips were blue, their hands stiff, their breathing shallow. He knew he had only moments to act. His hands moved quickly. He threw wood into the fireplace and lit it with trembling fingers. Flames burst to life, crackling loudly in the silence. Warmth began to spread slowly through the room. He lifted the sisters again and placed them closer to the fire, wrapping them tighter in blankets. Their bodies shook as if fighting between life and death. He rubbed their arms, trying to bring back feeling into their frozen skin. For a long moment, he just stared at them, wondering who they were, where they came from, and why fate had put them in his path. The storm screamed outside, but inside the small cabin, the only sound was the crackling of fire and the weak breathing of the alien sisters. The man sat down, his back against the wall, watching them carefully. He did not know if they would survive, or if they would wake and see him as a savior or a threat. All he knew was that his warmth was the only thing standing between them and death. The sisters lay still, wrapped in his blanket, shadows dancing across their strange faces from the firelight. Their survival now depended on him, and as the night deepened, a new story had begun, one that would change everything. The fire burned brighter inside the cabin, filling the room with warmth and light. The man sat close to it, his hands stretched forward, rubbing the heat into his frozen fingers. Behind him, the two alien sisters lay on the floor, wrapped in blankets, their breathing shallow but steady. He kept turning his head to check them, making sure they were still alive. Their faces looked pale, but not as lifeless as before. The storm outside beat against the wooden walls, but inside there was safety, at least for now. He stood up and moved closer to them, kneeling down. One of the sisters stirred, letting out a weak sound. Her eyes fluttered open for just a second, then closed again. He frowned, worried that it might not be enough to only give them warmth. They needed food, strength, something more than fire and blankets. He went to his bag and pulled out some dried meat and a small flask of water. Slowly, he returned to them and lifted the older sister's head gently. Her skin was still cold, her lips cracked. He brought the flask to her mouth and let a few drops fall onto her lips. At first, she did not move, but then her throat swallowed weakly. That gave him hope. He tried again, and this time she opened her mouth slightly, taking in a little more. He placed the flask down, then broke the dried meat into small pieces. He chewed one piece himself first to soften it, then pressed it gently against her lips. She made a faint sound, hesitant, but then took it. The man sighed in relief. He looked at the younger sister next. She was smaller, her breathing softer, as if she was slipping away. He touched her shoulder and whispered softly, though he knew she could not understand his words. He tried the same with her, giving her a few drops of water, then some softened food. Her eyelids flickered, and she swallowed. It was weak, but it was something. After feeding them, he sat back against the wall, watching carefully. The sisters seemed a little more alive now, but their bodies still shook with cold. He thought about building a second fire, but his cabin was small, and there was only enough wood for one. He wrapped more blankets over them, pressing their bodies closer to each other. Then he noticed something. The older sister's hand moved, clutching weakly at the edge of the blanket. Her eyes opened slowly, just enough to look at him. There was fear in her gaze, sharp and clear even in her weak state. She whispered something in her alien language, her voice trembling, her words too soft to understand. The man raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. She tried to sit up, her body shaking with effort. He quickly reached to steady her, but the moment his hand touched her arm, she flinched, her eyes wide with panic. Her other hand moved toward her side, and that was when he saw it. Hidden under the folds of her torn clothing was a small knife. She tried to pull it out, but her strength was too little. The blade slipped from her hand, clattering onto the floor. The man froze, his heart racing. He had been right to think they feared him. To them, he was a stranger, maybe even an enemy. He did not move toward the knife. Instead, he slowly picked it up and placed it far across the room where neither she nor her sister could reach it. Then he looked back at her and spoke softly, even though she could not understand his words. His voice was calm, almost like he was talking to a frightened animal. The sister's chest rose and fell fast, her eyes locked on him. But after a moment, her strength gave way, and she collapsed back down, unable to hold herself up. He gently placed the blanket over her again and returned to sit near the fire. He did not want to scare them more than they already were. Time passed. The fire grew stronger, filling the cabin with more warmth. Slowly, the sisters' shivering began to ease. Their breathing grew deeper, steadier. The man's eyes grew heavy with exhaustion, but he did not let himself sleep. He knew he had to keep the fire alive through the night. Without it, they would freeze again. At one point, the younger sister stirred and whispered something in her alien tongue. Her small hand reached out, trembling, and touched her sister's arm. The older one responded with a weak sound, but they did not open their eyes. He watched this small moment, realizing how much they depended on each other. The man sighed. He wondered who they were, why they had been out in the storm, and how they had ended up collapsed in the snow. Aliens were not common in this land, and most people feared them. But here they were, two helpless sisters in his home, and now their lives rested in his hands. As the night deepened, the storm outside grew wilder. The cabin shook from the force of the wind, snow beating against the windows. The man fed the fire more wood, the glow flickering across the sisters' faces. They looked peaceful in the firelight, but he knew that when they woke, fear might return. They might not understand his kindness. They might think he saved them only to harm them later. He looked at the knife lying on the far side of the room. He could have kept it for himself, but he did not. It belonged to them, and he wanted them to know that. Still, he knew when they were strong enough, they might try to use it against him. He accepted that risk. He leaned back, closing his eyes for just a moment. The warmth of the fire and the weight of the day pressed heavily on him. But even as sleep tried to take him, his ears stayed sharp, listening to every breath, every faint sound. The sisters were alive for now, but the danger was not over. The hardest part was yet to come. The storm outside roared, but inside the cabin, a fragile silence hung between human and alien. Fear, mistrust, and survival were now tangled together, and though the fire kept them alive, the real test would begin when the sisters woke fully and decided whether he was a friend or an enemy. The morning light crept slowly into the cabin, pale and weak through the frosted windows. The storm outside had calmed, but the world was still silent and white. The fire had burned low during the night, but the man had kept it alive, feeding it wood whenever it threatened to die. He sat in his chair with tired eyes, his body aching, but he had not allowed himself to rest fully. His mind was alert, waiting for the moment when the sisters would wake. The older one stirred first. Her breathing grew heavier, and then her eyes opened slowly. She blinked at the cabin walls, then turned her head and saw the man sitting near the fire. At once her body tensed, and her hand moved quickly, as if reaching for the knife she had lost the night before. But when her hand touched only the blanket, she froze. Her eyes narrowed, full of suspicion. The man did not move. He only raised his hands slightly, palms open, showing he carried no weapon. He pointed to the fire, then to her, then to the blanket covering her body. His gesture was simple, but his meaning was clear. He had saved her, not harmed her. Still, her eyes stayed sharp. She whispered something in her alien tongue, her voice low and trembling, filled with both fear and anger. He could not understand the words, but the way she looked at him told him she did not trust him. The younger sister shifted beside her, slowly waking. She opened her strange-colored eyes, blinking at the warmth of the fire. When she saw the man, she pressed herself closer to her sister, her small hands gripping the blanket tightly. She whispered something, and the older sister answered softly, her tone protective, her gaze never leaving the human. The man knew they were afraid, and he knew fear could make them dangerous. So he moved slowly. He took a piece of bread from his bag and held it out, resting it on the wooden floor between them. He did not walk closer. He did not force it. He simply left it there, then returned to sit by the fire. The sisters looked at the bread, but did not touch it. The younger one's stomach growled loudly, and she glanced at her sister, whispering again. The older shook her head firmly, as if warning her not to trust the gift. The man saw this, but he did not argue. He simply took another piece for himself, chewing it slowly, showing that it was safe. Minutes passed. Finally, the younger sister reached forward with trembling hands and took the bread. She bit into it carefully, chewing slowly. Her eyes widened a little as the taste filled her mouth. She quickly took another bite. eating with more urgency now. The man noticed the change, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of hope. The older sister still refused, her eyes locked on him as though he was some hidden threat waiting to strike. She kept her arm around the younger one, protecting her even while she ate. The man respected her caution, but he also knew that mistrust could not last forever. Later, when he poured water into a small cup and placed it near them, the younger sister drank eagerly. The older one only watched, her lips pressed tight. Her body was weak, but her spirit was strong. She whispered again to her sister, her eyes filled with warning. The man sat silently, listening to their strange language. He could not understand their words, but he could feel their emotions. Fear, hunger, doubt, all of it was written in their voices. He wondered what kind of life they had lived before collapsing in the snow. What had they run from? Why had they been out there in the storm with no protection? The hours passed slowly. The fire grew strong again, filling the cabin with warmth. The younger sister's cheeks no longer looked so pale, and her hands stopped trembling as much. She even glanced at the man once or twice, not with fear, but with curiosity. The older sister noticed this and pulled her closer, whispering something sharp into her ear. The man understood. Trust was not easy, especially between strangers, especially between human and alien. But he also knew that survival sometimes forced people together, whether they wanted it or not. When he stood and went outside to fetch more firewood, the sister's eyes followed his every step. He opened the door, letting in a rush of icy wind, then closed it again quickly. When he returned with wood, the younger sister had inched forward and picked up the empty cup he had left. She placed it carefully back where he had set it before, as if returning it. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the first step towards something more than fear. The man gave her a small nod of thanks. She did not smile, but she also did not look away. The older sister, however, only tightened her jaw, her distrust deep as ever. That night, as the storm outside raged again, the man spread more blankets near the fire. He gestured for them to come closer to the warmth, but the sisters hesitated. The younger one wanted to move, but the older shook her head. They whispered back and forth, their words quick and tense. Finally, they sat where they were, refusing his offer. The man sighed, but did not force them. He wrapped himself in his coat and leaned against the wall, watching them from the corner of his eye. The firelight danced across their faces, showing the fear in one sister's eyes and the quiet hope in the other's. Sleep came slowly, but his mind stayed alert. He knew trust would not come easily, but he also knew that in time, actions spoke louder than words. He had chosen to save them, and he would continue to keep them alive, even if they believed he was their enemy. And so, in that small cabin hidden in the snow, a fragile balance formed between human and alien. Fear held them apart, but survival tied them together. What they did not know yet was that the danger outside was far greater than the fear inside, and soon they would have no choice but to trust him or be lost forever. The cabin was quiet, except for the crackle of firewood. The man sat close to the flames, sharpening his knife on a flat stone. His eyes moved often toward the two sisters. They had grown stronger since the night he had carried them from the snow, but their bodies were still weak. The younger one dozed lightly, her head resting on her sister's shoulder, while the older watched him carefully, her gaze sharp and suspicious. She had not spoken to him directly, but her eyes followed his every move. That morning, the silence finally broke. The younger sister whispered something to her sister, and then looked at the man with hesitant eyes. She pointed to her stomach, then pressed her hand to her lips, as if begging for food. The man reached into his bag and pulled out some dried bread. He placed it near them and stepped back. The younger one took it quickly and began eating. The older, however, only stared at the man, as though searching for his hidden intentions. Later, while the man repaired a torn part of the wooden wall, the older sister began to whisper in her alien tongue. At first, he thought she was only speaking to her sister, but her voice grew stronger, almost like she wanted him to hear. He paused in his work, listening carefully. Her words were strange to him, but her tone was not. It was full of warning, full of fear. She pointed toward the window, then to the snowy woods outside. Her face grew tense, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. The younger sister clutched her arm tightly, whispering back, her voice worried and soft. The man realized then that something was wrong. These sisters had not simply collapsed in the snow by accident. They were running from something. When he looked at them questioningly, the older sister's eyes narrowed. She made a gesture, 2 fingers pressed together, then slicing across her throat. The meaning was clear enough. Someone had tried to kill them. The man's chest grew tight. He asked softly, though knowing they could not understand his words, "Who is hunting you?" His voice carried more to himself than to them, but the older sister's reaction told him his guess was right. As the hours passed, more pieces of truth slipped out through their whispers. The younger sister let out quiet sobs as her sister spoke, and from those broken words, the man caught fragments that repeated often. Family. Blood. Lineage. It became clear that these girls were not just ordinary travelers. They carried something important, something that made them a target. That night, as the snow fell heavy again, the man went outside to gather wood. The world was silent, the sky dark. But as he stepped into the deep snow, he noticed something unusual. Prints. Footprints that did not belong to him or the sisters. They were fresher than yesterday's storm, and there were many of them, leading through the trees. His heart raced as he crouched to study them. The size of the boots was large, the depth heavy. Whoever had made them was armed, moving in groups. Quickly, he returned to the cabin, his face hard. He shut the door, dropped the wood near the fire, and glanced at the sisters. They saw the change in his face immediately. The older sister whispered something urgently to the younger one, and both of them sat straighter, their fear rising. The man knew they could not stay hidden for long. Whoever was out there would not stop until they found what they were chasing. And now, by saving the sisters, he had drawn himself into their danger. The older sister seemed to sense his discovery. She pointed toward the door and spoke again, her words sharp. She pressed her hand over her heart, then pointed to her sister, then to him, shaking her head. It was as if she was warning him. "If they find us, you will die too." He stared back at her, his jaw tight. He did not need translation to understand the message. But he also knew he could not throw them back into the snow. Whatever bloodline or secret they carried, they were still just 2 weak, frightened girls who had barely survived. That night, he could not rest. He sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, his knife ready in his hand. The fire burned low, and the cabin felt smaller, pressed by the weight of the storm and the danger lurking outside. The sisters huddled together under the blankets, whispering quietly. Sometimes their voices rose, their words broken by fear, and he could only guess at their meaning. Then, close to midnight, he heard it. A faint crack in the snow outside, a shadow moving between the trees. His body stiffened. Slowly, he reached for his rifle, leaning against the wall. He did not move toward the door yet, but his eyes sharpened. He waited, listening. Another sound came, a low whistle, carried by the wind, then silence again. Whoever they were close. Closer than he had feared. The sisters stirred, sensing it too. The younger one clung to her sister, whispering in panic. The older's eyes turned toward him, and for the first time, her fear matched his. She was no longer suspicious of him. She was terrified of the hunters outside. The man pressed his finger to his lips, signaling them to stay quiet. He moved closer to the fire, letting the glow hide the tension in his face, pretending as if nothing was wrong. But his mind was racing. He knew he had little time to prepare. The night stretched on, heavy with silence. Shadows shifted outside, unseen eyes watching the small cabin in the snow. The sisters lay trembling under their blanket, and the man sat with his rifle across his lap, staring into the fire but listening to the dark. The truth had revealed itself. The sisters were being hunted, and now their enemies had found this place. The cabin was no longer a safe shelter. It had become a trap, and soon the hunters would close in. The night was darker than any before. The storm had slowed, but the silence it left behind felt even heavier. The man sat by the fire, his rifle across his lap, his ears sharp for every sound outside. The sisters were awake too, their wide eyes fixed on the door, as if they could sense the danger waiting beyond the walls. The younger one trembled quietly, clutching the blanket, while the older held her close, whispering soft words in their alien tongue to calm her. The man's mind raced. He had seen the footprints earlier, and now he could feel it. He was being watched. He stood and moved slowly to the window, wiping away a thin layer of frost with his sleeve. The world outside was white and shadowed, the snow glowing faintly under the moon. At first, he saw nothing, only the dark line of trees in the distance. But then, movement. A figure stood among the trees, almost blending with the shadows. Then another. His stomach tightened. They were here. He turned back to the sisters. The older one was already watching him, her face pale but determined. She had understood without words. The hunters had found them. The man knew he had little time. He quickly gathered what he could: extra wood for the fire, a small lantern, a knife, and his rifle. He pushed a heavy chair against the door and checked the shutters on the windows. The sisters followed his movements with anxious eyes. The younger one whimpered something, but the older silenced her, her eyes never leaving the man. For the first time, there was no mistrust in her gaze, only desperate hope. Then, faintly, the sound came. A crunch of boots in the snow. Closer, slow, purposeful. The man's grip on his rifle tightened. He crouched low, his eyes on the door. The sisters huddled together, clutching the blankets like shields. Another sound followed, a low voice outside speaking in the alien tongue. The sister's eyes widened, and the younger one covered her ears, shaking her head. The man could not understand the words, but he could feel the tone. The hunters were calling for them, mocking, certain of victory. A shadow passed by the frosted window, and then a heavy knock rattled the wooden door. The man froze, his heart pounding. The sisters whimpered softly, fear in their every breath. He lifted a finger to his lips, signaling silence. The knock came again, harder this time. Then another voice shouted, deeper, crueler. The older sister whispered something quickly to him, her hand reaching out. She pressed her fist to her chest, then pointed toward her sister, and then the door. Her meaning was clear. If the hunters broke in, she would fight, even if it killed her, to protect the younger one. The man shook his head slowly. He mouthed the word, no, even though she could not understand. He tapped his chest, then pointed to the door, showing he would face them himself. Suddenly, the door shook violently. Someone was trying to break it down. The sisters gasped and pressed against the wall, their faces pale with terror. The man lifted his rifle, aimed at the door, and waited. The wood groaned. The chair blocking it creaked under the force of the blows. Then silence. For a long moment, everything was still again. The man's finger hovered on the trigger, his breath shallow. He knew the hunters were clever. They would not waste their strength on the front if there was another way in. He turned sharply to the window, and just in time, glass shattered as a shape lunged through. The man fired without thinking, the blast echoing through the cabin. The figure fell back, crying out in pain, and another shadow moved behind it. The sisters screamed, clinging to each other. The man reloaded quickly, his hands steady despite the rush of fear. He knew more were out there. He could hear their boots crunching in the snow, circling the cabin, searching for weakness. He rushed to the window and shoved a piece of wood against the broken frame, blocking the cold air and slowing any attempt to climb through. The night became a tense game of silence and sudden noise. The hunters threw stones at the walls, testing his strength. They whispered cruelly outside, their words sharp like knives. The sisters cried softly, the younger hiding her face against her sister's shoulder, the older biting her lip until it bled. The man moved like a shadow through his own cabin, checking every corner, every wall. His heart thundered, but his focus was sharp. He knew he could not let fear control him. If the hunters came, he would fight, not just for himself, but for the two fragile lives trembling in his home. Suddenly, a torch flared outside, its light spilling through the cracks. More followed. The hunters were gathering, their shadows stretching long across the snow. They were preparing to strike together. The man drew in a deep breath. He set more wood on the fire, letting the flames roar brighter, filling the cabin with light and warmth. He looked at the sisters, their frightened eyes locked on him. He gave a single nod, as if to promise he would not let them be taken. Then the sound came. Footsteps rushing, snow crunching fast. Shadows surged toward the cabin from all sides. The hunters had come. The man raised his rifle and whispered under his breath, words only he could hear. Not tonight. Not while I still breathe. The door shuddered as the first heavy strike landed. The sisters clung to each other, their whispers like prayers in their alien tongue. The man steadied his weapon, the firelight dancing across his determined face. The cabin was about to become a battlefield, and every second would decide whether they lived or died. The door shook again and again, each strike louder, stronger. The man braced himself, his rifle steady in his hands. The sisters clung to each other in the corner, their eyes wide with terror as the wooden planks cracked under the force. Then, with a final crash, the chair blocking the door splintered, and the hunters forced their way inside. The first one burst through, a tall figure wrapped in dark armor, his eyes glowing faintly under his mask. He carried a curved blade that shimmered in the firelight. The man fired without hesitation. The sound thundered in the small cabin, and the hunter fell back, clutching his chest. Another rushed in immediately, swinging his weapon wildly. The man ducked, the blade grazing the wall, and slammed the butt of his rifle into the hunter's face. Blood sprayed as the figure collapsed to the ground. More came, shadows filling the doorway. The man moved fast, loading and firing, every shot echoing against the walls. The sisters screamed and pressed themselves against the wall, their small bodies trembling. The older sister's eyes, however, were sharp, watching every movement as though memorizing the way he fought. The hunters roared in anger, circling the cabin. Some tried to climb through the windows, their hands reaching in. The man grabbed his knife and slashed at the first, cutting deep into the wrist. The hunter howled and fell back into the snow outside. Another tried to force his way in, but the man drove the knife straight into his shoulder, pushing him back with all his strength. Blood stained the snow beneath the broken window. But he was only one man, and there were too many of them. A blade scraped across his arm, cutting through his coat and drawing blood. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain, and slammed his attacker against the wall. The fight was desperate, brutal, and close. Every second mattered. The sisters cried out as one of the hunters broke past him and rushed toward them. The older sister threw herself in front of the younger, shielding her with her body. She grabbed the small knife hidden under her blanket, her hands shaking, but her eyes fierce. The hunter laughed cruelly, raising his blade. But before he could strike, the man hurled his knife across the room. It struck the hunter's throat, and he collapsed at their feet. The sisters gasped, frozen, as his body hit the floor. The man grabbed another piece of wood from the fire and swung it like a weapon, flames bursting as it struck a hunter's face. The smell of burning filled the air as the man kicked him back out into the snow. He turned quickly, firing the last bullet in his rifle into another who had charged through the door. The cabin filled with smoke, blood, and the heat of battle. Then silence. For a moment, only the crackle of the fire and the sisters' heavy breathing could be heard. Bodies lay across the floor, blood spreading across the wooden boards. The man stood in the middle of it all, his chest heaving, his arm bleeding, but his eyes still sharp, ready for more. But it was not over. A deep voice echoed from outside, cold and commanding. Another figure appeared in the doorway, larger, stronger than the others. His armor was darker, marked with strange symbols. His weapon was a long spear, glowing faintly as if alive with power. He stepped inside, his eyes locking on the sisters. The older one gasped, her face pale with recognition. She whispered a name, her voice filled with fear and hate. This was not just a hunter. This was their leader. The man tightened his grip on his empty rifle, then tossed it aside. He bent down and pulled his knife from the fallen body, his hand steady even though blood dripped from his wound. The leader raised his spear, pointing it at him, and spoke in the alien tongue. The sisters whimpered, pressing themselves deeper into the corner. The man did not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. The leader was claiming the sisters, demanding he step aside. But the man did not move. He planted his feet firmly on the blood-stained floor and stared back with unshaken eyes. The leader lunged forward, the spear cutting through the air. The man dodged, the tip slicing across his shoulder. Pain burned through him, but he didn't falter. He swung his knife, striking against the spear's shaft. Sparks flew, the force vibrating up his arm. The fight was fierce and fast, the spear's reach keeping him at a distance. Every strike of the glowing weapon was meant to kill, but the man fought with fury. He ducked under a swing and slammed into the leader's chest, knocking him back a step. The sisters cried out, their eyes wide as the two men clashed in the firelight. The leader stabbed forward again, the spear grazing the man's ribs, leaving a burning wound. The man roared in pain, but used the moment to get close. He slashed with his knife, cutting deep across the leader's side. The alien staggered, his armor dented, but his eyes burned with rage. They circled each other, blood dripping onto the floor. The fire roared brighter, casting wild shadows. The sisters clung to each other, whispering, their voices full of fear and prayer. The leader swung again, aiming for the man's throat, but he ducked and grabbed the shaft of the spear, yanking it forward. With a desperate cry, he drove his knife into the alien's chest, again and again. The leader gasped, his glowing eyes fading, before collapsing heavily onto the floor. Silence filled the cabin once more. The man stood over the body, his chest heaving, his arm bleeding badly now. He dropped the knife, his strength nearly gone. The sisters rushed forward, their fear replaced with relief. The younger one touched his arm gently, tears in her eyes, while the older stared at him with something new, respect and maybe even trust. The cabin was a ruin, the floor stained with blood, the walls broken, but they were alive. The hunters had been defeated, at least for now. The man leaned against the wall, sliding down to the floor, his eyes closing as exhaustion took over. The sisters stayed close, their bodies trembling, their hearts full of the truth. They had found a protector, someone who had fought death itself to keep them safe. Outside, the snow fell silently again, covering the battlefield in white. But inside the cabin, 3 lives had changed forever, bound together by blood, fire, and survival. The cabin smelled of smoke, blood, and cold air drifting in through the broken window. The man sat slumped against the wall, his body heavy with exhaustion, his clothes torn and stained red. His breaths came slow and painful, every inhale burning his chest. Around him, the floor was littered with bodies of the hunters who had thought him weak. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, its glow painting the sisters' pale faces in flickering orange light. The younger sister knelt beside him, her small hands pressing against his wounded arm. Her eyes were full of tears, her lips trembling as she whispered in her alien tongue. Though he could not understand her words, the tone was clear, pleading, desperate, afraid to lose him. The older sister stood behind her, her face hard, but her eyes softer than ever before. She looked at the man not with suspicion now, but with something heavier. Gratitude. Respect. A bond had formed that could not be broken by fear anymore. The man forced himself to move, groaning as he tried to sit straighter. He shook his head at the younger sister, trying to tell her he would be fine, though he knew the wounds hurt deeper than he admitted. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder, her tears hot against his skin. For a moment, he let his hand rest on her hair, comforting her the only way he could. The older sister crouched too, studying the wound with sharp eyes. She tore a strip from her own clothes and pressed it against his side, stopping the bleeding. Her hands were steady, even though her lips trembled. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she did not look away. Instead, she gave a single nod, a silent promise that they would not let him die. Hours passed in silence. The storm outside had calmed again, the snow falling gently now, as though the world itself had grown tired of violence. The fire kept them alive, and the cabin became something more than a shelter. It became a place where 3 strangers had turned into something like family. When the man woke after a short rest, he found the sisters sitting close to him, one on each side, their bodies pressed near his for warmth. They had refused to sleep apart from him, as if afraid he might disappear if they let go. He stared at the fire, his mind heavy with thoughts. He had not planned for this. He had saved them without thinking, but now, after the blood and the fight, he knew there was no going back. Their lives were tied to his now. The younger sister stirred and looked up at him with her strange-colored eyes. She whispered something, then touched her chest and pointed to him. It was not a word he could understand, but her meaning was clear. She was calling him protector. She had accepted him as more than a stranger. She had given him a place in their lives. The older sister watched this, her face unreadable. For a long time, she stayed silent, but then she too spoke softly. Her voice carried strength, and though he could not understand, he felt the weight of her words. She was giving him honor, recognizing him as someone worthy. For someone like her, who had doubted him so fiercely, this was more powerful than any weapon. The man closed his eyes briefly, letting their voices sink into him. He was tired, his body broken, but something inside him stirred. A warmth that was not just from the fire. He had spent years alone in this frozen land, surviving only for himself. But now he was not alone. The sisters had changed everything. The next morning, the world outside was calm, white snow stretching endlessly. The bodies of the hunters had been covered overnight, buried by the storm. It was as if the earth itself had erased them, leaving only silence behind. The man stood in the doorway, his wounds bandaged, his rifle in hand. Behind him, the sisters stood side by side, wrapped in blankets, their faces still pale but stronger now. They looked out at the horizon, then at him. He knew more danger would come. The hunters would not stop, not if the sisters truly carried something powerful in their blood. But he also knew he would not turn them away. He had chosen his path the moment he lifted them from the snow. The younger sister stepped forward and slipped her small hand into his, her grip warm despite the cold. She looked up at him and smiled faintly, the first smile he had seen from her. The older sister hesitated, then placed her hand on his shoulder, a silent promise of trust. The man nodded slowly, his eyes on the endless white land. The storm had nearly taken them. The hunters had nearly killed them, but they had survived together. And now they would face whatever came next together. That night, as they sat again by the fire, the cabin felt different. The fear that had once filled it was gone, replaced by something stronger. The younger sister leaned against him, her eyes closing in peace, while the older one sat watch, her gaze steady but no longer suspicious. The man stared into the flames, his hand resting lightly on the blanket covering them. He realized then that the warmth he had given them in the snow had done more than save their lives. It had changed all of them. It had created a bond that no storm, no hunter, and no fear could ever break. In that small cabin, buried in snow, 3 lives had been rewritten. A human, once alone, now carried the weight of 2 alien sisters who trusted him with everything. They had come together through cold and blood, and now they would walk forward into a world that would never see them as strangers again. And though the night outside was still bitter, inside the cabin, there was only warmth. The warmth of survival, of trust, and of something new that felt almost like family.